Hi, welcome back to Grains in Small Places, and today I wanted to share with you my super soft sandwich bread. So I made a video for this super soft sandwich bread a long time ago with one of my old mixers. This one I'm going to be using my Ankarsrum mixer, so it's for anyone that's trying to learn how to use that. But if you don't have an Ankarsrum mixer, you can still use this recipe and all the methods perfectly the same. But I wanted to film a video dedicated just to the sandwich bread because my old video, the sandwich bread is kind of in with my cinnamon swirl bread, and I think there's a cookie recipe all in one video. So I wanted you to be able to access this video easier in case you have friends that are working with fresh milled flour and are looking for a super soft sandwich bread recipe. This one is one that you can send to them without them having to watch the other recipes in case they're not ready for those other recipes, because I know a lot of times sandwich bread is one of those first things we try to master with fresh milled flour so that we can get sandwiches out on the table. So let's get started. Alrighty, so to make the fresh milled flour super soft everyday sandwich bread, we're going to be using some hard white and some kamut. Now, you can sub out hard red for the hard white. You could sub out spelt for the kamut. You could just use all of the hard white or all of the hard red. I just really love the taste and the texture that kamut allows for bread products. So that's why you'll see me using it in a lot of my recipes. Another thing I wanted to go over before we get started is I went ahead and printed off my fresh milled flour everyday sandwich bread. This is, if you haven't been to my website, it's grainsinsmallplaces.net. All of my recipes have a free printable version, and you could go in and print them off. And in the ingredient section, I have where you would have 4x8 pans, 4.5 by 8.5 pans, or the 9x5 pans. So each ingredient section is for whatever pan size you're using. Because I am using these small 4x8 pans. Let me grab one. They're very small. If you've been following me for a while, you know I live in an RV. We travel full time. And so I have just a very small countertop oven. But I do realize that bread comes in all shapes and sizes, and people have different sizes of bread pans. So I wanted to make sure that you knew I updated that depending on what bread size pan that you have. So I hope that's helpful. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into milling our flour. So I really like to weigh my wheat berries first and then mill them. So when I'm weighing out my wheat berries, this recipe calls for a total of 485 grams of wheat berries. So I'm going to measure that out for these. I show in my recipe here where I say 405 grams of hard white and 80 grams of kamut. That's just a blend or balance. No. That's just a blend I find works really well for bread. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do. I will also make sure to put a link to this recipe in the description box below. It'll have all those different sizes. And then I'll also put in the description box below links to the products that you see me using, my mixer, my mill, the grain bins here. I get a lot of questions about those. So that way you'll know where to find it. So let's go ahead and measure out 405 of this hard white wheat. And this may vary slightly for you. This will make a little bit of a wetter, stickier dough. I find that working with fresh milled flour requires a wetter, stickier dough. There I go talking and I mismeasured. But that's what allows it to be nice and soft and airy. So if you add too much flour to this, it will be more of a denser loaf. So if you're looking for a sandwich bread with a little bit more of a denser loaf, add a little bit extra flour. And then I'm gonna go ahead and add in the 80 grams of the kamut. Okay, 485. grams. So as I was saying, I measure this out. I have 485 grams of wheat berries. When I mill this, I should get 485 grams of flour, give or take 1 or 2 grams. You know, sometimes there can be a little bit of a variation. But then I know that I've milled enough wheat berries to make the flour that I need, rather than just guessing and pouring it in and then having a whole bunch of extra flour, because I always mill all of my recipes basically to order. So if I'm making something, I'm going to weigh out the wheat berries, measure it, and mill it. If I'm having a big baking day, then I might go ahead and mill a whole bunch of flour, but this is the way I typically do it in my day-to-day life. So I'm going to go ahead and take this on over to my mill. This is my Nutrimill Harvest Grain Mill, and I have a coupon code that I can share with you. The coupon code is GRAINY, and if you use that, you can save $20 off your grain mill at the Nutrimill/Bosch website. And that coupon code is good for any of their mixers or even their classic grain mill if you prefer that one. Okay, and here is our freshly milled flour. I did want to mention one thing. I mentioned that measuring out your wheat berries in grams will equal the same amount of weight in flour. That is not the same for volume. So if you measure out 1 cup of wheat berries, that will not give you 1 cup of flour. It will actually give you more than that. So I'm just strictly speaking by weight, and I wanted to make sure I clarified that so there was no confusion. Okay, so while that's milling, I can just use this same old vessel here with my scale, and I'm going to weigh out my wet ingredients. So I'm going to use 180 grams of water. So I'm just going to put that in there. And just so you know, my recipe that I'll have in the description box, when you go to that, it'll have the volume and the weight. I do prefer to go by weight because I find like that it's more accurate. But if you only have availability of do it by volume, that is there as well. I understand there's all kinds of different bakers, and we all do it just a little bit different, and I have no problem with that. Okay, I'm going to zero that out again. And anytime you're weighing anything, just make sure that you zero out the vessel. I have had people message me and we couldn't figure out why the measurements were so off. And then we realized that the scale had forgotten to be tared out or zeroed out. So just make sure, I know it sounds silly, but it happens to the best of us. So I'm going to use 180 grams of milk. If you are dairy free, you can use a dairy substitute here, or you can just use all water. If you prefer a little bit more enriched, then you can just use all milk. So either way, you can use half milk, half water like I'm doing here, or one or the other. Also, another delicious option is you can use buttermilk in this recipe, and that is delicious as well. To this, I'm gonna add 3 tablespoons of butter. Again, if you're dairy free, you can use oil instead of butter. I'm going to go ahead and take this and warm this up in the microwave. If you don't have a microwave or you prefer to not use a microwave, you can always put this in a saucepan and just warm it up until the butter starts to melt. We don't want this to be super hot. If this is super hot, we could kill our yeast. So we don't want to kill our yeast. So just make sure that it is warm to the touch, maybe let's say between 90 and 100 degrees. No higher than 100 degrees. We don't want to kill that yeast. So let's go ahead and warm this up. While that's warming up, I'm going to go ahead and grab my Ankarsrum mixer. The last time I made this sandwich bread, I was using a different mixer. So I've had people message me asking me if I can make this in the Ankarsrum mixer. If you don't have an Ankarsrum mixer, you can still make this recipe perfectly fine without any issues. Every mixer is just a little bit different. So I do like the way that this mixer kneads the dough. It's very gentle with it, and it just makes a nice, supple, tender bread dough. So that is definitely a perk. But the Bosch mixer is amazing as well. The only thing with the Bosch mixer is what is so great about it is that it kneads the dough so quickly, but also that can be a little more challenging when you're new because it kneads so quickly, it can also over knead it quickly. So just oh, that's our that's our liquids. So just make sure that you are watching the dough anytime you're doing a new recipe, anytime the weather's a little different, anytime you're using a new wheat berry, even if it's the same hard white wheat from the same manufacturer, if it's a different bag, it can all be just a little bit different. So just make sure you're watching it each time it's a little different until you get to know your dough, I guess I could say, because once you understand how it's supposed to look and feel, it's like, bah, all the lights go off and you know, the angels are singing and everything once you see this come together. So that's one of my passions. I really like to teach people how to get that moment. And I just love it when I get messages or comments of people letting me know that they finally saw that happen. So that's just really special. And I appreciate you all for sharing that moment with me. So let me go ahead and put the rest of this on. I put that back in the microwave for 30 more seconds. It was not melted. So with the Ankarsrum mixer, I'm going to put in my dough scraper. This does come with a dough hook. I do have a complete review of this mixer and the very first time I ever used it on my YouTube channel. And I also have where I use the dough hook. I believe it's done again. Sorry. Okay, I believe that is my soft pretzels. So if you're interested in watching me use the dough hook, I do use that on a video with my soft pretzel recipe. Okay, so I am happy with that. The butter's not completely melted. This is not too warm that I can hold my finger in here without it scalding me or hurting. Nothing's boiling or steaming or anything. So I'm gonna go pour that in. I'm gonna go ahead and put in 3 tablespoons of sugar. Again, this is my 4x8 loaf. This will make 2 small bread loaves. So the amounts that I'm giving you will vary if you have larger bread pan sizes. Let's slide this up. We're gonna add 1 large egg. If you only have small eggs, you can always put in 2 here. It never hurts to add just a little bit extra protein, and it also helps the bread. It's kind of like a lecithin substitute. Just gonna wash my hands real quick. Alrighty, and I'm just going to give that a little mix here. Put that on in. Okay, and I'm gonna add 1.5 teaspoons of salt. I really like to use sea salt, and I'll tell you why. If you use Redmond's real salt, which I love this for cooking. I think it's a great product, an amazing company, but I will say that there have been some issues with this leaving grit in baked goods. I'm not sure why it happens. I'm guessing it's the extra minerals that are in this because this is actually mined salt. So if you're having a problem with grit in your bread, and you think that it's caused by your wheat not ground smooth enough, it may be your salt. So try making it with some sea salt. See if that makes a difference for you. There have been people that have had success with taking that salt and pulverizing it in a blender or whatever to make it finer, and they haven't had any issues. So it definitely can be used in your bread. It just may take an extra step. So I just grab for the sea salt when I'm making bread, and I use the other salt for all of my cooking. And then I'm going to set this to the side because I'm gonna need this as my reminder. I'm gonna go ahead and pull this forward. And we'll just get started on kneading. This right now, I'm going to turn it on the lowest setting. Well, I guess I should pull this back a little more. Sorry about that. Okay, the lowest setting on my dial, so the slowest it'll go, and I'm gonna turn it on just on. And that's just gonna mix all of these ingredients through properly. They're pretty well already mixed. It's okay if your butter sticks to your roller. I'm just gonna turn it up just a bit and turn it back down. Now I'm gonna slowly add in my flour. So you may have heard anytime you talk to somebody making bread with mixers, they'll say to continue to add flour until it clears the side of the bowl. And to that, I find is not true with fresh milled flour. Maybe to an extent, I guess. If you are experienced with working with fresh milled flour, that may work for you because you understand how it looks and feels. But for somebody new learning fresh milled flour bread, I do not recommend to just keep putting flour in with, you know, say you have a KitchenAid. I would not recommend putting flour in until it clears the side of the bowl, because fresh milled flour takes a lot longer to absorb the liquid. Also, it needs to be a little bit wetter and stickier than what you may be used to. Okay, everything looks pretty well mixed up. I wanted to make sure that there was no dry flour. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and take this off and put the lid on it to do its first rest period, which is sort of called an autolyze period. Anytime you're using, if you're new to this mixer, anytime you want to move this to let it go back all the way, you always need to give it just a little gentle pull towards you to turn this knob back here. Because if you try, you can strip the screw, from what I understand. It's luckily not happened to me, but you want to take that tension off. And if you take the tension off, this is so easy to move. If this is difficult or you're struggling getting the pin up or down or anything, you just need to pull that tension off just a bit. Okay, so there's a little dry stuff up here. I'm just going to use this to scrape this down. Okay, so what I'm going to do is put the lid on that came with it. And I put this on top. So I've had many people message me laughing, saying, oh my goodness, I can't believe I forgot to add in the yeast. And they remembered this silly little trick. So this trick, I like to put this here to remind me that I have not put the yeast in. I get questions asking why I don't put the yeast in. And part of it is convenience and part of it is, I guess, science. So the convenience factor is, if at this point in time I have something come up and I need to run errands, I need to do laundry, or if you have small children and they need your attention, or something happens and this has to sit for longer than the 15 minutes and it sits for, say, 2 hours, it's no big deal. We don't have to worry about it. The yeast is not in here, which means the yeast has not been activated. So that's basically my convenience reason. The science reason is basically it goes along with the same thing. Once I put the yeast in here, it's automatically starting to be active. So I really want the yeast to give me their most strong power during my rise period, because I know that when I start kneading this, I have more time. That once I put the yeast in, I will start kneading, and that will activate the yeast for me. I start out with warm liquid. This also is another great tip for especially beginners, because if you did get that liquid a little bit too hot and you give it this rest period, it may cool it down a little bit before you add in that yeast. That way it won't kill the yeast. So, but I will tell you, I've put warm liquid in here and I have let this sit for 2 hours and come back, and this is still, you know, not hot, but it's still at least room temperature, if not a little warmer, and that is plenty to activate the yeast. It does not have to be hot. If for some reason time gets away from you and it sits longer than you expected, and the dough feels cold, that's no problem. You can still put in the yeast, but your rise time will be a little bit longer. So your rise time with your yeast has to do with the yeast itself. Also, it has to do with how warm, the weather, the humidity, all of that. So the warmer it is in your house, the warmer the dough is, the faster it will rise. One more thing, if you're using active dry yeast, you want to make sure that you activate your yeast with a little bit of the water and sugar from the recipe at this point in time. So you'll put your yeast in a small bowl, a little bit of that water from in here and a little bit of that sugar before you put it in your recipe. Put it in that bowl, wait for this 15-minute period, and it should get nice and foamy. Once that's nice and foamy, you know that that active dry yeast is viable and good. So when I give the recipe and we come back after this 15-minute rest period and I put my yeast in, you will just take that whole thing of active dry yeast and pour it into your dough and then continue the recipe the same way. So I wanted to go ahead and cover that for you so that you knew what to do if you're using active dry yeast. So we will be back in about 15 minutes and we'll put in the yeast and then we'll start the kneading process. Okay, so it's been about 15 minutes. This was our reminder. We still need to put the yeast in. This is when you would go ahead and dump in your active dry yeast if that's what you're using. I'm using instant yeast. Okay, I'm gonna pull this away from the side just a little bit. I like to get my instant yeast in bulk. I've gotten it from Sam's Club in the past most of the time. I know Bread Bakers sells some great yeast, but I have this little jar, and I keep this little jar in my refrigerator, but I have, let me show you. Oh, I guess I'm showing you all my secrets today. Anyway, this is the instant yeast that I bought from Sam's Club. I keep it in a freezer safe bag. This stays in the freezer. I use this and I refill that little jar, and that stays in my refrigerator to keep it fresher longer. And then I always have another 2 pounds, you know, ready to go, since this one's almost gone. So it may seem like I have a lot of yeast, but it may not last as long as you might think. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and mix this yeast in. And I know I like to pull this away from the side a little bit, and then I'll just pull this in to make sure that I'm getting all of my yeast all mixed throughout. So I know some people will start timing the kneading from the very beginning when they put everything together, but really I consider before this rest period just mixing and not the kneading. But now, once this is all mixed in, we can consider this our kneading process. If your dough starts to rise up your roller ball and come over the top, that means you want to pull this away from the edge a little bit. So you'll need to loosen this at the same time that you pull this in, so that it can easily go around. I find that it's not necessary to knead this at a high speed. This comes together nice and beautifully. I'm gonna go ahead and set my timer for 4 minutes on here. I have been noticing that my old batch of hard white wheat would sometimes take 20 to 25 minutes to knead into a nice stretchy dough, which we'll call a window pane, but we'll go over that when we get there later on in the video. But my next batch only took about 6 to 8 minutes after this autolyze, where we let it rest. This batch has been taking me somewhere in between. So I've gotten multiple batches of different wheats from different places. So I'm not saying one place is better than another. I don't think that's it. I think it's just the wheat harvest crop. So this is still on the lowest speed, and I'm happy with this speed. I'm happy what I'm seeing in the dough, what's going on here. In fact, I may just tighten that just a hair. Okay, so what we want to see here is we want to see the dough is actually getting, I guess, squished a little bit against the side as it goes around each time. If I turn this up, it would turn into that little halo ring, and I like to do that when I have larger batches. This is just one batch to make 2 small loaves, so I may not get that halo ring. I probably don't have enough dough in here to get that, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I like that. So if your arm is just banging and banging and banging and banging, that means you need to pull this away from the side like that and then tighten it. So when you tighten this, it is not made to hold this still. It is only made to not allow it to go that closer to the bowl anymore. So when I tighten this screw back here, it only allows this to not, I can push it. I cannot push it that way, but I can push it this way all I want, if that makes sense. So if I untighten this all the way, you'll see that it kind of pushes my dough up, and my arm is kind of going this way a little bit. So, and I got that halo effect. But I like to pull it away just a little bit where I can see down in here where the dough is getting kneaded and smushed, but this thing isn't just slamming back and forth. So I just kind of watch it. I do how I like it, and then after that 4 minutes is up, we'll go ahead and check for stretchiness. So I'll be back after the timer goes off, which will probably be here soon because I've been talking. Okay, so to check this dough, which I can tell by looking at it, it's very shaggy and jaggedy and rough, that it's not ready, but I just want to show you. This is after about 4 minutes of kneading. Now this may be different for your mixer and your wheat berries, but I'm gonna get my hands wet because it's easier to touch this dough if your hands are wet, but this is what I have. So if you see, I can pick it up and it's a little bit stretchy. It's definitely stretchy, but it just kind of wants to tear apart. If you have a problem with getting your dough over kneaded, you could even stop it at this point in time, when not in 4 minutes, I'm not saying, but maybe 4 minutes, but just when your dough looks like this. So when I go to pick this dough up and it wants to stay mostly together and it's a bit stretchy, those are all good signs of the gluten development. Now, there are rare cases that your hard wheat may be very low in protein or not able to form gluten. So that I do know that Sue Becker mentions this, that there were a few years in the past that wheat was very low in protein and not able to form gluten very well, even the hard wheats. So that's why she said she was adding in vital wheat gluten to her bread. So if for some reason you were to get a batch of that, that is an option. I used to use it way back when I was first learning and I was using her recipes. And then I realized, kind of stumbled upon this on accident, that if you just knead your bread longer, it will form that gluten as long as the wheat is capable of forming that gluten. But I personally have not had it to the point where I have not come across a batch that I have not been able to successfully knead long enough. So there is a chance that it can over knead. Some mixers are easier to over knead than others. I do have a little short video showing you what under kneaded dough looks like, which would be this. What over kneaded dough looks like, which I don't want to show you because then this batch will be gone to waste. But I do have a video where I do show you that. It's just a very short clip in my shorts. You can search for what does over kneaded dough look like, I think. Maybe even grains in small places in that keyword, it should find it. And then perfectly kneaded dough, which hopefully I'll be able to show you here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and put this back on for just another 2 minutes, and then we'll come back again. I want to show you the different stages of the dough and the gluten development, because I think that's the most important thing over top of, you know, recipes, over top of amounts, weights, everything. The best thing you can do is learn what your dough should look like and feel like. Then you will be able to master any recipe. So the methods that I teach here, I guess I have a blog post about these methods. It's called the GISP method. GISP standing for grains in small places. I did not give myself that acronym. My Facebook and YouTube fans have given me that acronym. So thank you for that, guys, because it's definitely a mouthful to try to type or tell people. So I have that talking about all of these methods in a printable version, but you can use these methods, the autolyzing, the longer kneading, higher hydration. You can use these methods with anybody's recipe. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that. You don't have to use this recipe, but these methods work really well with this recipe, and it's a tried and true recipe. So I'm sorry this video is a little bit wordy, but I really want it to be like a masterclass on making a super soft sandwich bread. So I'm going to go ahead and set the timer for 2 more minutes. And wash off my hands. Okay, so I do want to point out, just for that very short time that I was talking to you, this dough did something a little bit just from sitting, which is kind of amazing because gluten develops over time as well as kneading. So kneading it will help the gluten develop faster, but time can also help the gluten to develop. So if you're using a KitchenAid or a mixer that sounds like it's overheating or struggling or getting hot, what you can do is do that first autolyze period where I had this covered for 15 minutes. You could do that longer. So that's step one that helps with shortening the kneading time. But step two, if you have one of those mixers, I'm gonna stick it in for 2 more minutes. But another step is if you have one of those mixers, you can let it mix for a few minutes, let it sit for a few minutes, then mix it for a few minutes, and then let it sit for a few minutes. Your mixer will thank you for that. It does take a little bit longer to do it that way, but I think you'll find that that will extend the life of your mixer and it will give you better results on your bread. The reason this mixer works so well is because it's a bottom drive shaft for it to spin around, as opposed to something like this is not doing the mixing. This is just sitting here. It's the drive at the bottom of this base that is doing all of the work. So it's puts stress points at a different area, which is what, oh, that was not 2 minutes. Which is why this mixer really seems to work very well. So you can see already it's kind of wanting to ball up on its own just a little bit more. I'd love to be able to show you this all in real time, but I never know exactly how long it's going to take to mix this up completely. But we're not there yet, and it's probably going to stop again on me. So I'm going to go ahead. Let's see, that was 4, 5, 6. So we're probably at 6 to 7 minutes of kneading. After this timer goes off, it should be somewhere around 8 minutes of kneading. And I can see, you can see around here down at the bottom, hopefully you can see that. When you're watching your dough, you can see that start to create like a little mound in the center, and then the dough will start to want to grab that in, and you'll start seeing it stretch. That stretchy fibers, or that stretchy webby, it's the best way I could describe it, that you're seeing is that development of gluten. So those are good things that you're seeing. I could tell this is not ready to go, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in a little longer. I'm going to put this just a little bit closer to the wall so you can see this gives a little bit more pressure on the dough. And I am still doing this on the lowest setting. Well, now it's writing up the thing, so I'll pull it back. This mixer does not require as much babysitting as it seems while I'm standing here. I'm trying to show you and teach you things, so I want to keep this out of the screen as much as possible, but also still do what I want it to do. So once you have made this dough multiple times, you know what it's supposed to look like, act like. You can set this timer for, 6 or 8 minutes, come check on it. If it needs to go longer, set it for a few more minutes, come check on it. It's not something you have to stand over top and continue to mess with it. It's just, this is what I'm doing in order to show you something. I'm going to go ahead and turn the speed up to maybe like the 1 o'clock position. It's okay if this scraper, gets a buildup of dough behind it or in front of it, no problem. You can stop this and scrape it if you want to, but I found that really it's no big deal to just allow it to build up, and eventually it actually gets big enough down at the bottom that this dough will grab it, and that kind of helps me start knowing to watch, because I know that the gluten is strong enough that this dough ball is wanting to pull this bread in, or this bread dough in. So I think you can see, yeah, you can see it getting longer and longer and longer over here. This is like build up behind my scraper. This is technically not really like supposed to scrape the sides like some people might think. It's really just to help guide that dough back towards the center and the roller. You can see that, how that was a nice long stream. That's showing me more signs of gluten development. I love to see that. I would like to see that do that and be harder for it to break. So we're still gonna keep going. Generally, the dough itself will start to look a little bit smoother as well and not so jaggedy, and that's another indication that it's kneaded properly and how you want it. So it's probably going to start grabbing that piece soon. So I can see, you see how stretchy that's getting? This is starting to look just a little bit smoother. We're still just at like this 1 o'clock position here. So barely faster than the lowest speed. I like the gentle, tender touch this mixer uses as it needs. I don't know if I can turn your attention to the center part here, what I was talking about, where that center grows into like a ridge and then it starts to catch in with the larger dough ball and it almost does like a twisting action. And I like to pay attention to that as well, because that gives me indication that my gluten is strong, or you know, if it breaks super easy, and it's starting to want to pull that in as well. So let me move it back over where we can see it. Okay, I'm gonna get my hands wet again. Just visually, I would still knead this dough, but I wanna show you where we're at. So it is nice and stretchy. You could get a slight window pane, but it breaks very easily. If you're new to working with fresh milled flour, you could stop right here when your dough is doing this, when your dough is wanting to stay together, and you can stretch it fairly thin. It's still a little bit lumpy and not so smooth, but if you're concerned about over kneading your dough, this will still make beautiful, nice bread. I'm gonna go ahead and knead it for a little bit while longer, just so I can show you what I'm talking about with the stretchy dough. Okay, so I believe we're in the neighborhood somewhere of like 10 to 12 minutes of kneading. I could be wrong, but we're also doing it on a, we started the first 8 minutes or so on the lowest speed. So I'm just gonna keep my eye on it. I don't have to set the timer, but it's helping me keep track of the time as the time goes by. I mean, it's just an estimation of about 3 minutes, about 4 minutes each time. Okay, so I hope you can see something different is going on here. Number one, that stretchy dough over there, but number two, where I spoke about that stuff in the center, you can see how it's grabbing, and now it's, instead of ripping, that center piece is coming off the bottom and sticking to this dough instead. You can see these long tendrils coming from what's sticking here that are wanting to stay, and this is wanting to just kind of dough ball up itself. So I'm gonna let it finish out the timer here. But this is looking great. These are good indications letting me know that the gluten has now developed, and we kind of just watched it happen in front of our eyes. I hope you noticed the change there. Trying my best to show it. But you can see it's no longer all stuck to the bottom, and it just almost happens like that. Like it almost happens quickly in front of your eyes. So this has probably been, let me just get it back over where we can reach it. Okay, so this has probably been about 18 minutes. That's what I was gonna guess is this new batch of hard white wheat has been taking somewhere between those two, which I mentioned. Okay, so now I hope you can see the difference in this dough. So when I stretch this, yes, it might still break, but we can get this super thin right here. If I held it up to the light, you could see through it, which is why it gets that window pane term. Even if it gets to this point, even when you stretch it, if it breaks a little bit, that is okay. It does not have to, you know, withstand you stretching it and not breaking. If it breaks, that's okay. If it's this stretchy, you want to stop kneading it at that point, because otherwise you're going to have over kneaded dough, and you don't want that. Okay, I'm going to pull this out. Now, is this dough wetter than your traditional bread dough that you've been making with white flour? Yes, it absolutely is. You didn't do anything wrong. I would say adding flour is probably the last resort. If you're having problems getting a window pane or getting it to knead into nice stretchy dough, usually the problem is that it needs more liquid, not more flour. But occasionally it needs more flour if it's really humid or it's rainy out. If you measured by volume rather than weight, that also makes it a little more versatile, so where you might need more or a little bit less. I'm gonna get some oil. I'm out of my spray oil. So I'm just going to drizzle a little bit of this on the dough. Whoop, that may be a little much. That's all right. Okay, so I'm going to, normally I would just use a spray and spray out my pan so that my dough doesn't stick. But this is another good sign. When I pull this up, all the dough wants to come out together. Yes, it's going to be sticky. And yes, there's going to be some still stuck to your mixer. So I even have some all up my sides here. Just, again, the spray would be helpful here. And then I'm just gonna make sure that's all coated with that. But you can see this is really nice, workable dough. It's nice and stretchy. It's not sticking terribly to my hands, but it is definitely wetter than your traditional bread dough. So I'm just, putting some more oil on here, and then I'll put the top on. Let me wash my hands real quick. Baking spray definitely makes that job go easier. But I'm gonna go ahead and put this lid on, and then I'm gonna let this rise for about an hour. If it's cold in your house, you may want it to rise closer to 2 hours, but you want it to basically double in size. I find that almost always it's around 1 hour, occasionally an hour and a half when it's cold. If you're using active dry yeast, sometimes it is the 1.5 hours. If it's cold, maybe the 2 hours. So lots of factors included. After about an hour, you can come peek on it. I've generally will just do an hour and then come check on it. That's just how I usually do it. So we'll be back after an hour. Okay, it's been a little bit over an hour. You can see it's nice and risen. So I'm going to go ahead and use my little dough scraper here. I've made sure to line my baking sheets with parchment paper. You don't have to do that, but I just like having the handles to pull it out and nothing sticks. I have no issues. I also like to use olive oil or some kind of neutral oil, avocado oil, something like that on my work surface rather than flour for shaping. This helps tremendously with wet and sticky doughs. And as I was mentioning earlier, wet and sticky dough is the way to go with fresh milled flour. So I'll just put a little bit on this, a little bit on my hands. And then that helps get this out of the pan so much, or the bowl so much easier. This is nice and beautifully tender. Okay, so not pretty now, but what I like to do is just kind of consolidate this into a little ball here and flip it over so you can see how nice and smooth it is. I'm just going to cut this in half because we're making 2 smaller bread loaves. You could measure this and make sure, just measure it, figure out what it is, divide that by 2, make sure that they're even if you want to do that. But I don't mind having them a little bit misshapen. You could use a rolling pin here if you wanted. I generally will just flatten this out with my hand. There's so many different ways to shape bread, but really it doesn't matter what method you use. The most important thing is that you want some surface tension. So the way I like to do it is kind of push in a rough rectangle-ish, and then I'll pull in this side, press out some of the air bubbles. Pull in this side, press out some of the air bubbles. And I'm making this little awkward triangle with this area here. You can see this dough is nice and loose. It's stretchy, but it all stays together. So then I like to take this little tip and I will roll it in itself, and I will give the rest of this dough just a little pull, not so hard that we're tearing it or ripping it. Just a little pull, roll it in, and then just give a little pull. It's just giving some resistance so that it gets a little bit tighter back here. So I just do that all the way down until I get to the end. And then you could put it in your pan just like this if you wanted to. If you have any of these funny little air bubbles, you can just, oh, this one's a bigger one than I thought. It goes all the way down. Okay, so you can just pop those, kind of press them back in. Works pretty great with this wet dough. So rather than have the ends like this, I kind of just tuck them and pull them under with my hands. Honestly, this is one of my favorite things to do when I'm working with fresh milled flour. This dough, I really enjoy kind of manipulating and just kind of pushing and pulling with my hands. And as I do this, that creates surface tension. I don't know if you can hear, but there's some beautiful songbirds in the background. So this little thing here where I pop those could show up in the bread after we're done, but I'm okay with it. All right, so that one has nice surface tension. Oh, there's another one. So when I pressed it flat, I must have not done a very good job getting those air bubbles out, but I'm okay. That's okay. All right, so that's gonna go in my first pan. And I'm going to do the exact same thing with this one, trying to press out the air bubbles maybe a little bit better. And if my counter was a little bit wider, I probably could press this out a little bit thinner. But I work with what I got. All right, so we're gonna squeeze those extra air bubbles out, make our little wonky triangle. That's the best, I know it's not a triangle, it's just the best way to describe it. And then I have this. We're going to just pull and roll that down, pull and roll it the same way. Again, you may have another shaping method, and that's perfectly fine. The important thing is to make sure that you have some surface tension. That really helps give a nice rise. So as I pull in these edges, I'm also then pinching underneath to make sure that the seams are closed. And while I'm doing this, that's creating more surface tension. So I'm getting more tension on the top. All right, so I'm just gonna go ahead and put that loaf in here. So now what we're gonna do is cover these and let them rise for about 30 to 45 minutes. It really depends on how warm it is in your house. I like to cover these for about 30 minutes and then come and just glance at them. I'll preheat my oven and then let these continue to rise. You want them to pretty much double in size. The best way to check them is if you poke on the dough and the dough just springs right back, it's not ready. If you poke on the dough and the dough comes back pretty fast but still leaves a divot, it's still not quite ready. But if you poke on the dough and it comes back really slow, then it's ready, because you don't want to wait until it's overproofed, because then what can happen is if you overproof your bread, it can collapse in the oven or it can collapse after it's cooling. So those are just some things to watch for. So I'm going to go ahead and cover this with some cling film, and I will be back after they have doubled. Okay, so I've updated this recipe from the past. So if you've made this in the past and the cooking temperature worked for you, but there was a lot of people that said that it browned too quickly on the top. So I'm going to go ahead and I updated the recipe. We're going to preheat the oven to 350 degrees. That's going to bake somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes. The best way to check that is with a thermometer in the center of the loaf, and we'll talk about that after it's done baking. So now these have been rising. It's been about 45 minutes or so. When I press on them, the dough comes back a little bit slowly. I'm gonna go ahead and preheat my oven. Here, an egg wash is optional, but I like what it does. It gives that nice brown and shiny finish on the top. So I'm gonna go ahead and egg wash these so they're ready to go in the oven once the oven preheats. And into the oven they go. Alrighty, so here they are. All done. Nice golden brown, shiny tops. But the best way to tell if they're done completely is to go in the center of the loaf, if that makes sense, and check for the temperature. So I'm pulling this down in. We're at 202, so that's perfectly fine. You want to make sure that it is above 190 degrees Fahrenheit in the center of the loaf. That way you know that it is done completely. It can go a little bit higher than that. This is a temperature that is for yeast bread. For sourdough bread, however, you may want the temperature to be a little bit higher than that, but this is a yeast bread. That does remind me, if you're interested in making a super soft sandwich bread, but with sourdough instead of yeast, I do have a recipe for that and a video for that. So I can try to remember to put a link to that in the recipe in the description box below. But if not, it is on my website at grainsandsmallplaces.net and on my YouTube channel here. So I'm gonna go ahead and take these out of the loaf pans right away. And as you can see, they just make small little loaves. What happens if I make one of those nice big, like, mushrooming out loaves is the top tends to burn because my oven is small. So let me pull this out. It's very hot still. Let me see if I can touch this just to show you. So I want you to see how that's hot. Very, very, very soft this sandwich bread is. So I'm gonna let this cool down completely before we go to slice it, and then I will bring you in when we slice it so that you can see the texture of the inside and how soft it is once it cools down. So we'll be back. Okay, so now that the loaf has cooled, you can see it's still nice and squishy. So I'm gonna go ahead and just take I would never normally cut it in half, but I'm gonna go ahead and take let you see half. So there is our sandwich bread. Look how nice, soft, and squishy this is. I don't have a bunch of crumbs on my board from cutting because we didn't add a whole bunch of extra flour. So this is ready to go. If you like your sandwich bread larger, you can of course use larger pans and go with the larger sizes I was showing you on the recipe card itself. So we're going to go enjoy some sandwiches. I hope you enjoyed making our super soft sandwich bread. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And thanks for stopping by Grains in Small Places. Goodbye.